Hi, my name is Scott Barber, and welcome to the Landscape Ontario podcast. This is a new series from Landscape Ontario Horticultural Trades Association, and it's a new way for us to examine important topics and talk with interesting people. Today we'll be speaking with Tara Zupancic. She's a public health scientist and writer who specializes in environmental health and health equity. Tara is the founder and director of Habitus Research, and she's the co-founder of the Center for Environmental Health Equity at Queen's University. Tara holds a Master of Public Health from the University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicine, and she currently lives in Caledon, Ontario. She joined me at the LO office in Milton to discuss some of the research she's been a big part of, which demonstrates something I think that a lot of us know intuitively, which is that nature and green spaces are good for us. But what's really important about Tara's work is that she's been able to use a public health lens and her academic background to really demonstrate that point. For example, Tara was the principal investigator and author of a really important report called Green City, Why Nature Matters to Health. It was published in 2015, and it was prepared for Toronto Public Health, and it ultimately led the city's Board of Health to call on the City Council and the Mayor of Toronto to increase the amount of quality green space in the city. Tara's doing really important work. She's a wealth of knowledge, and she has some really cool information I think is really valuable for horticulture professionals, both in terms of when you're talking to homeowners and clients about the value of what you do, but also from an industry-wide perspective when we look at the story we're going to tell to young people who are pursuing careers in landscaping and horticulture, and about how the work that we do is so valuable for our communities and our cities and for people and our health. So I think you're really going to enjoy this interview. It's coming up right now. The Landscape Ontario podcast is sponsored by Dynascape Software. LO members save 15% on Dynascape products, software upgrades, and online training. Visit dynascape.com for details. Hi Tara, thanks so much for being with us today. It's really great to have you here at the LO office to speak about some of the research that you've been a part of, which examines the connection between green spaces and nature with human health. First, I'd like to start with just how you became interested in these topics.
So I was one of those typical kids that would spend a lot of time in nature. And, there's research that supports that your early childhood, spending time in nature, influences your interests as an adult and how you feel and how you care about the environment. So I definitely was one of those statistics. But I mostly was interested in focusing on children's health. But then when I started university, that's when I had a chance to read Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, Our Stolen Future by Theo Colburn, Having Faith by Sandra Steingraber, and all of these really looked at the intimate relationship between the environment and our health, and really underlined that the sort of illusion of the environment out there and us is just that, it's an illusion. And I was hooked from that moment on. It sort of put together my passion for children's health with the environment. And from that moment on, I continued to study in public health, focusing on environmental health.
Fantastic. And could you take us through just a little bit of an overview of some of the most significant benefits that green spaces have on human health and sort of what you've learned over the years? Maybe just start on a sort of bird's eye view on some of the major things that you've learned.
Sure. Yeah, I could really talk for hours about this. The research over the past 10 years on this topic has exploded. In the past 5 years alone, there's been at least 7 scientific systematic reviews, which is, they look at the past 10 or 20 years of research. The most significant one, I would say, was authored by James and colleagues from Harvard University, and that was in 2015. And even then, that is considered out of date, actually, because there's been so much published since then. So at a very high level, what we know is that time in nature or spending time in green spaces provides immense support to mental health. So there's very strong associations between time in nature and reduced risks of depression, anxiety. So for example, the study out of Stanford University in 2015 showed that a 90-minute walk in nature actually shifted brain activity. So the brain scans would show that it would shift brain activity away from rumination. And that's the part of the brain that cycles over and over again in negative thought patterns, and it's a risk factor for depression and anxiety. And they had another group who took a walk in an urban setting and the brain scans didn't show that shift, that effect. So that's important because it's not just about the physical activity. So it's not the physical activity that seems to be causing this shift. It's something about the connection with nature. So that's just one example. The link between mental health and time in nature it appears to be strongest in children, which is really important. So we know that more time in nature improves sleep. It's associated with reduced stress hormone production, a better ability for children to concentrate and focus and learn. Some of the most interesting research has been around ADHD and the impact of nature. And what's really interesting about that body of research is that since 2001, almost every study published has shown that time in nature for children either showed a significant reduction in ADHD symptoms or a significant improvement in their ability to concentrate and learn. And they also found that with a study in Stanford that the 90-minute walk in nature improved the adult's working memory. So we know that it can potentially help with our ability to learn, improve sleep, mental health. Then, of course, there is the influence on physical activity. We know that children in a natural setting, they move their bodies more. They move differently. They're more active. They're more creative. We also know that it helps children, it improves their social development. Children in a natural setting play much differently than they do in more of a structured setting. It's less competitive. So it's supportive for building relationships. And then lastly, like I said, I could talk for 2 hours about this. Lastly, there's an amazing body of research growing about the influence of nature on the immune system, and that's an area that I'm particularly fascinated with. We know that one of the largest studies ever done on nature and health, so they looked at over 350,000 people and found that people living in greener environments had a lower incidence of numerous major chronic diseases. And we also know, have you heard of forest bathing or?
I think I have. Yeah, is that a Japanese kind of cultural?
Yeah. So when I first heard this, I thought taking a bath in a forest, like that's what I thought. And I thought that actually sounds lovely. But that's not what it is. So forest bathing is sort of a metaphor that you go into a forest and you immerse yourself in the nature that surrounds you. But there's an incredible study that came out in 2010, I believe, in Japan, where they found that by taking a 2-hour walk in the forest 2 days in a row, increased natural killer cell number and activity by over 50%. So natural killer cells are known they're the cells that like to attack cancer cells. And so not only did it increase the number and the activity of the natural killer cells, but the increase was significant even 30 days later. So after you leave the forest and go back home. So there's still a lot of research that needs to be done in this area, but it really is very important, and that may be part of the reason that there's this association between incidence of chronic disease and exposure to green space. We don't know. Yeah, but
so there's more work to be done.
Yeah, more work to be done.
So there's actually, but we're seeing the research is showing there's actually a physiological response. Do we know what do we know about what it is about nature and plants that has this impact on people? Yeah,
so there's a lot of different theories. So at this point, the state of the research shows these associations. And it's the consistency of the evidence. Different studies, they've done, studies with small groups, and then they've, so for example, in Scotland, there's the National Health Survey, where they track the health of all of residents in Scotland, and they have looked at the relationship between time in nature and mental health. And so they find that whether you're looking at a small study with a small group of people or you're looking at a large population like that, there seems to be a lot of consistency in the findings, and that there's even a dose-response relationship. So the more time you spend in nature, the greater the benefits. As to the reasons why, that's where we're headed. That's where we need to go. And there's a lot of theories about it. And my own personal opinion and bias is that it's never, we live in this culture where we always want the silver bullet, the one answer. And I think it's a number of things happening. Our immune system is boosted. Our DNA is evolved over time. We are meant to be outside. If you look at the evolution of human beings, the time that we've spent indoors, especially now, with 80% of Canadians living in cities, is really a blink of an eye relative to how much time. So our ancient DNA wants to be outside. So that's what I say the reason is that's where we have adapted. And so there's so much of our body, from our immune system to our brain function, that feels better in nature.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when you talked about forest bathing, so obviously forests, and when you talk about nature and green spaces, what are the types of environments, particularly when we talk about urban settings or cities where so many people live, what are the types of spaces that have these benefits?
Yeah, so it depends on what benefits we're talking about. So, for example, if we're talking about the benefits that trees provide in terms of regulating climate, air temperature reduction, filtering pollution, then you're looking at what's really important, and this is looking at a city level. What you want is a diversity of tree species. That's really important, especially in a climate like Canada, where you have spring and fall, winter and summer, and different species function differently. So, for example, the deciduous trees are essential in the summer, obviously for providing shade, for evapotranspiration and cooling. We also know the conifer trees are better at capturing particulate matter. And then also with the extreme heat waves, you also want a diversity of plants that can adapt to the heat, can adapt to the cold. So diversity improves the resilience. So what you want is pockets of nature throughout the city that are connected. The connectivity makes a big difference in terms of cooling the air and cleaning the air. So that's at a high level. On a more local level, where we're talking about personal health, boost to your immune system and your mental health, if we're talking about a city setting, what you're really looking for is what I call pocket nature, nearby nature. There's some really interesting research that for people, you don't even have to sit and spend time in it, but just on your daily commute, if you're walking out the door, just to have a small pocket of nature that you look at can actually provide benefits. So it's really important to think of a number of different things in these spaces. So you want it to be attractive, but not necessarily ornamental. And that's the big difference. It needs to be, I call them nature traps, where ideally, if you only even have a small pocket of space, you want to maybe put 2 chairs down with a tree, with some maybe more native plants to attract pollinators and to attract, that's a big part of it, birds, bees, things that are attracted into that space. So it's inviting, and it invites people to want to stop and to stay. And so that is really important. A lot of people think that, especially in the city, if you don't have much space, there's not a lot you can do, but there really is, particularly making a space to sit and stay in that space. Yeah.
And when you say, what does it look like when you say when it's connected? Like specifically, could you give some examples of what that looks like in a city when the green spaces have that connectivity that you mentioned?
Yeah, so I mean, that's really, so now we're talking about urban planning. So we're talking about the links between from park to park, green corridors, walking spaces, places that are safe to bike. So what you want is, you could imagine, ideally you have a park space, and then you have either a roadway or a bike lane that is surrounded by trees, so that if you are taking an aerial view of the city, what you see are rivers of green rather than pockets of it. So, and that's not to confuse that with pocket nature, which is just having little bits of nature in the fronts and backyards. But so when you look at an aerial view, what you want to see in a city ideally is minimum 40% tree cover, and you want to see rivers of green that are all connected. And what that does is the connectivity also improves air circulation for the entire city. So when you see a leaf waving in the wind, you in a way you have to start thinking of them as hundreds of thousands of fans waving in the wind, and they're actually pushing the air through the city. So they're absorbing particulate matter and pollution, they're pushing fresh air through the city, they're cooling the city, and last but not least, by creating spaces like that, you've created a setting that people enjoy being in, so that when they move to park, to street, to park, they might want to take their bike, or they might want to walk instead of hopping in their car, because it's a very welcoming space and it's a place to be. So even if people don't have time to spend in nature, forest bathing, as much as we all want to, if you can create a space that your commute to work is surrounded by green, that in and of itself is beneficial to mental health, but it's also beneficial to the city as a whole, the whole city's health. Not to mention, we haven't even got into what that can do for climate regulation, dealing with the heat waves from climate change, dealing with flood prevention. It just goes on and on.
Yeah, and that's definitely where I'd like to go in terms of the heat aspect, which we know is having such a big impact on health in urban settings. And what role do green spaces and nature and parks and that connected green space that you mentioned have in mitigating that urban heat effect?
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and trees and green space have so much to offer, and I would love to see big changes. We're seeing big changes, but I'd love to see more. So heat, I can't understate it. It's a killer, and we know that as we're seeing every summer after summer these extreme heat waves, you're seeing increased calls to the hospital, increased mortality, death, and heat-related illness. So we know in 2015 I did a systematic review for the David Suzuki Foundation, and this was also in collaboration with Toronto Public Health and EcoHealth Ontario, to look at that. So we were looking at what does the research tell us about the capacity of green space to provide cooling in the city. And so in general we know that while trees are the best at it, they're the king or empresses or however you want to put it of cooling the air, every type of green space that we looked at, that was studied, provided some level of cooling. So if you're in a city setting where you don't have space for a tree, there are so many other options. There's the lovely green wall that you have here that I was welcomed to when I came into your office. And the green walls and green roofs are really interesting because they can provide some amount of cooling, to the city. But in general, the range is a reduction between 1 and 7 degrees air temperature cooling in a city. And that doesn't sound like much, but we know, I'll just give you an example. In Toronto, a study that was done showed that for every 1 degree increase in maximum temperature, there was a 29% increase in ambulance response calls for heat-related illness. So that 1 degree is huge. It can literally save lives. And so I really think that that's where we need to head. It's not, there's a lot we need to do in terms of heat waves, but creating green cities and spaces for people to get relief is really important, particularly when we're talking about people who may not be able to afford air conditioning, who may not live in the ideal housing circumstance. Having public spaces that provide that nearby and as much as possible is really important.
Yeah, it can be a game changer.
Yeah.
And just to circle back to the air pollution aspect that you mentioned before, again, what role do you think do green spaces, does nature in a city have in terms of mitigating the effects of pollution and their effects on human health?
So for every 1% in temperature reduction from trees, it's estimated that would save 850 lives and also prevent 650,000 illnesses. So that's just a small 1%. And we know that trees in particular are really great for dealing with particulate matter and a lot of the pollution that comes from automobile exhaust. So for example, there's a first of its kind study ever done where they installed a line of birch trees on the curbside in front of a house, and they measured the particulate matter before the trees were installed and then after. And they found that the particulate matter in the house was reduced by half. So, and like I said, that's a first of a kind study, but it goes to show, the potential for something like this when you think about schoolyards, nurseries, daycares, hospitals. So a lot of these spaces that are in an urban setting, how important it is to have that landscape around those areas where you have, children who are developing, you have people who are in hospital who are sick. And the other interesting part is green roofs. They, in some cases, if it's a very narrow street canyon, sometimes trees actually hold the pollution in. A lot of different reasons for that, but generally if the road is wide, it's a good candidate for to put trees to reduce pollution. But what's interesting is that green roofs around the streets actually funnel fresh air down into the canyon and can reduce air pollution from traffic where the pedestrians are walking. So again, it just emphasizes from green roofs to walls to trees, there's huge health benefits for putting green spaces into every nook and cranny in a city. Yeah,
absolutely. Now, what role do you think the horticultural professionals that are planting these trees and maintaining these plants and trees and spaces, what role do you think they have when it comes to improving health outcomes in our cities and our communities?
Yeah, well, the first one is to really start thinking of themselves as health workers. I have this talk that I give a lot about, people that work in urban forestry and horticulture don't think of themselves as working in health. And so I sometimes feel like my job is to tell them that they absolutely do. That particularly in public health and preventive health care, having these green spaces, like I said, from ranging from, your physical health, from your lung capacity, to your mental health. So, people working in horticulture have so much to offer. I think one of their challenges is to help to talk to the people that they serve to start reframing, so feel confident about the health benefits that they're providing and start sharing that information, because by doing so, ideally, this is my bias, we can start moving away from looking at green spaces as aesthetic, ornamental, sort of fringe, nice to have but not crucial, need to have, to places that contribute to health, even if they're small pocket spaces. So, maybe we do less of the ornamental Japanese maple. I'm sorry, no prejudice against the Japanese maple, but we see a lot of those in the front yard, and start thinking as these front yards and backyards as these spaces for people to spend time. And so I think there's a huge opportunity to share a lot of that health information and inspire, whether or not you're working for the city or whether you're working for a school board or whether or not you're working privately for someone that their home, that you're offering information, that there's a huge array of ways to set up a green space that can provide cooling, can inspire people to want to gather together. These outdoor learning classrooms, they're wonderful, and kids use them even when they don't have a class. They will go, if you give them a place to sit in the trees or around the trees, they will go there. So to creating these inviting spaces, thinking about native species, encouraging pollinator population. So I would just hope that horticulturalists feel empowered about their role in providing health in cities.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's something that a lot of people in horticulture and landscaping already know intuitively. It's probably one of the reasons why they got into the profession, is that love of nature, their love of plants, and their understanding of those benefits. And it's really amazing to talk to you and to be able to look at the research that is backing that up, that feeling that we have as people in the industry. And that we've probably always known, and that we know as kids, as you say, kids are drawn to nature. They are more active in nature. It's this innate thing that we have. And, as urbanization continues, we've sort of moved away from it. And hopefully we can start to push the pendulum the other way and understand what we need to do to make our cities more livable and more healthy. And actually, that takes me to one of my last questions for you is about what is a green city? What does the ideal city look like for you? And what do you advocate for when you're talking to policymakers and politicians and people that really have an impact on city planning and so forth? What's sort of your message, and what would you hope to see?
Yeah, I have a lot to say, but I'll try to keep it short. Number one is, when it comes to green spaces, we need to talk about equity. So, there's sort of an expression that, if you want to know where the wealth is in a city, just follow the trees. You can take aerial photos and you can see. And it's just the way the market works. If you can afford a big backyard with big trees, you will buy that. But I think there's a responsibility as urban planners and politicians to ensure that If anyone is living, let's say, in a high-rise building in less than ideal housing conditions, then it's more important than ever that they have really inspiring, not just adequate, but inspiring play spaces, particularly for children, that provide all the benefits that we talked about today. So that is really important. And even if you're not thinking about equity and you're just thinking about the health benefits for the city, as I was talking about these green connected spaces, you want an aerial photo of a city where you just see green distributed evenly everywhere. That, for me, that's a sign of a healthy city, or at least one sign. So what I think is really important for making that happen, particularly for children, is access to green space can happen in many different ways. But one of the easiest ways, from my perspective, is through daycares and schools and hospitals where children spend a lot of time, people spend a lot of time. But if you want to ensure equitable access, there's so much potential to develop those spaces. I know in Toronto, the school board owns an immense amount of land, some more inspiring than others. And it's just a fabulous place. If that's where kids are going every day and spending their time, that's a fabulous place for an equitable approach to making sure that all kids have access, even if they're going home to a less than ideal circumstance. Maybe they don't have a big backyard, that every day when they go to school, there's that opportunity. And I think, we're seeing a shift with the outdoor classrooms. We're starting to get it, but I would love to see more. And I'd also love to see more on hospital grounds, any public grounds. There's just a huge opportunity and a relatively inexpensive one compared to so many other things that, has to come out of the public purse. Maintaining and supplying green spaces is relatively inexpensive and provides so much benefit to the people living in the city, but also to the sustainability of the city as a whole. So that's my message. Yeah.
That's fantastic, Tara. I so appreciate you coming. I know we could probably talk for hours, and maybe we can do that another time, but I think we'll leave it there. And that was really fantastic. A great overview of some of the work you've been a part of and some of the research that you've studied that, like I said, really reinforces these things that as horticultural professionals and landscapers, we really intuitively know. And it's fantastic to see the research really demonstrate it. So thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.